at the crossroads of global order, also known as EU Cross, investigates the challenges and opportunities that the European Union and its main international partners face in times when our conventional understanding of the global order is put into question and multilateralism is contested. EU Cross focuses on two central themes. One, the EU's strategic reorientation in global affairs, including the new emphasis on principled pragmatism and resilience in its 2016 global strategy, and its enduring support for a rules-based and cooperative international order. And two, the specific challenges and opportunities for the EU to foster bilateral and multilateral cooperation with its main international partners, the United States and Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, while duly taking into account the latter's recent actions and changes in strategic direction. More specifically, EU Cross will investigate these two main themes through the lenses of following 5 policy areas: trade, sustainable development, migration, counterterrorism, and human rights. Coming to our distinguished speaker, my dear friend, Professor Matthieu Burnay. Matthieu is assistant professor in global law at Queen Mary University of London. He is also a visiting professor at Beijing Normal University, Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, as well as an associate researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. His main research interests are in global law and governance, the study of the political and legal aspects of EU-China relations, as well as the comparative study of the rule of law in Europe and Asia. He has recently published a monograph on Chinese perspectives on the international rule of law, law and politics in the one-party state. By the way, he's also currently teaching a class at Jindal Global University. As an academic and a friend, Matthieu inspires me immensely. I know him to be someone who has always been at the cutting edge of research in his field. He has been visiting China and India and learning about their role in the world since long before it became the mode to do so. He is also a relentless networker and a creator of opportunities, and was personally responsible, along with a couple of common friends, co-conspirators, in roping me and Jindal Global University into the EU Cross Network. He has very recently been awarded another Jean Monnet collaborative grant on EU-China legal and judicial cooperation. So in case your last Erasmus Plus or Jean Monnet grant application was unsuccessful, it is because Matthieu corners off 50% of the fund each year. The theme of Matthieu's lecture today is the EU's relations with China, seen in the current context of a landmark anniversary of economic reform in the PRC. I believe that this theme not only straddles the various policy areas of concern to EU Cross, but also has the potential to pinpoint the very ways in which we speak of a changing global order. So please join me in welcoming Matthieu to the first of 3 EU Cross lectures that will be hosted by the JGU's Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives. It's over to you.
And I would like to thank again the organizers for their very warm welcome. I mean, I've been treated so well, since I arrived in Delhi a few days ago. So it's a real pleasure for me to get the chance today to make this presentation on, let's say, a very topical issue that is, EU-China relations, which may not seem to be as topical, but more specifically, a presentation on the relationship between the EU and China in the specific context of the 40th anniversary of China's reforms. The year 2018 marks indeed a very important anniversary. It is like 40 years ago that the Chinese Communist Party decided to transform China's economy in a way that would, I quote, meet the needs of modernization. It is this decision 40 years ago which enabled China to re-emerge, and I really insist on this idea of re-emergence, as a central political and economic force in global governance, and also as a country which has now become one of the key stakeholders in the main global governance institutions. I will mention some of them in this presentation, more particularly the World Trade Organization. When we think about China's reforms, I mean, one of the first ideas which come into our mind are the so-called Chinese characteristics. Those specific characteristics which relate to this reform process which started 40 years ago. Indeed, when we think about, I mean, China's reforms, it's quite striking that these reforms are kind of unconventional, at least from a Western perspective. You can think more particularly about the unchallenged role played by state-owned enterprises in the Chinese model of corporate capitalism, but you can also refer, for instance, to the resilient capacity and adaptability that the Chinese Communist Party has shown in the last 40 years of reforms. We can obviously talk about the Chinese characteristics, but we should not forget that those Chinese reforms have also been facilitated in a certain way by China's growing participation into the dynamics of globalization. This participation into the dynamics of globalization have led China to become increasingly interdependent with a number of international actors. And you see me coming, the European Union is obviously one of them. So the kind of key argument that I would like to bring forward here today is the fact that the EU-China strategic partnership constitutes a proof of not only the scope, but also the very limitations of both the reform process, which has been undertaken by China, but also the role of the European Union as a global market force and also as a so-called normative power. So this lecture will hopefully tell us not only something about the nature of China's reforms, but also about the type of power that the European Union is, or that the European Union is not. So this presentation will be divided into 4 parts. In the first part, I would like to look more particularly at the economic dimension of the EU-China strategic partnership. Then I would like to look at the difficulties for the European Union to behave as a normative power, trying to export its key foundational values towards China in the context of the EU-China strategic partnership. And what we will see here is a great paradox between, on the one side, the very significant economic interdependence between the European Union and China, and on the other side, the great difficulties of the EU to behave and to act as a normative power, able to actually export some of its key values in the context of the EU-China strategic partnership. Then in the third part, I would like to focus on the ongoing negotiations of a bilateral investment treaty between the European Union and China, which actually offer the European Union a kind of possibilities to solve that paradox, to reconcile in a certain way the EU's interests in enhancing its trade and investments relationships with China, while still sticking and promoting in a certain way some of its key values, human rights being one of them. And then in the last part, I just would like to talk a little bit about the recent developments, not only within the European Union, but also obviously within China, and more particularly the idea of an authoritarian advance in the current governance system of China and its potential impacts on the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China. But before I get there, let's start from the very beginning. And by the very beginning, I mean the establishment of bilateral relationships between the European Union and China back in 1975. On this picture, I mean, you can see the well-trusted minister of Mao Zedong, Burnay, meeting, I mean, the first ever British commissioner, the first ever representative or appointed commissioner by the United Kingdom after the UK's accession, how funny it is, right, to the European Union back in the 1970s, so Christopher Soames. That was in 1975, and I just wanted to mention this quote of Zhou Enlai, who said back in 2075, "We support the peoples of Europe in uniting themselves to safeguard their sovereignty and independence. We are for the view that the cause of European unity, if it's carried out well, will contribute to the improvement of the situation in Europe and the whole world." The idea of this quote is really to show that China, from the very early days, has proved to be very supportive of the very idea of the European integration process. As early as the 1970s, China started to show a particular interest in Europe, which you can actually justify or explain by a number of factors. The fact that a number of leaders of the time, Deng Xiaoping being one of them, had spent quite some time in Europe, it's something which should not be understated. Also, the idea that as early as the 1970s, China was looking to acquire technology and markets in Europe, in addition to those in the United States, was obviously also an important factor. And last but not least, in the 1970s, China was obviously very much interested in the fate of the socialist countries in Europe, which also explains why the enhancements of bilateral ties between Europe and China was considered as something important from the Chinese perspective. Obviously, the relationship has gone a long way, right, since the 1970s. And here, what I would like to talk about is obviously the current situation. And if you want to understand the current situation, let me first say a few words on the kind of institutional structure of the relationship between the European Union and China. It is back in 2003 that the European Union and China decided to establish a so-called comprehensive strategic partnership, testifying of the fact that for both partners, at least in theory, the bilateral relationship is something which is considered important. On this graph, you can actually see the structure of the multiplicity of dialogues taking place at the bilateral level. And I guess that the first idea which comes into your mind is, wow, so many dialogues. And I take your point that too many dialogues kills the dialogues, right? Here we are talking about more than 60 bilateral dialogues, which are taking place under three main pillars. There is a political pillar, under which you have, among others, the human rights dialogue I will be talking about later on in this lecture. Then you have the economic dialogues, and then you have the so-called people-to-people dialogue, the idea being that the relationship between the European Union and China should not only be managed by diplomats, but that people like you and me, students, academics, entrepreneurs, should also participate, in the dynamics of, the EU-China strategic partnership through different means of track 2 diplomacy. So this is just to say a few words on the actual structure of the relationship. Now, the first key point which I would like to make here is that a significant part of the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China is centered around economic and commercial issues. A reality, a state of affairs, which tends to confirm in a certain way the idea of the European Union being primarily a market power. An idea which was developed, sorry for the brackets there, which is not with the reference here, which is not completed. So the idea that the EU's identity, both historically and presently, is crucially linked to its experience with market integration. And this is something that we can also see with the economic data. Nowadays, the European Union is the first economic partner of China. Let's never forget that. Before the United States, the European Union is the first economic partner of China. The other way around, China is the second main economic partner of the European Union. What is obviously quite striking when you look at those numbers is, I guess, the significant imbalance in the bilateral trade relationship between the European Union and China, with China exporting way more goods than the European member states are actually exporting to China. This trade deficit is obviously a significant issue, and both partners do have their own explanations. On the European Union side, there are obviously many complaints about market access issues in China, more particularly in the area of services. But you can obviously add to that the number of non-tariff barriers, also, the lack of respect of intellectual property rights, cash subsidies to Chinese companies, and you name them, right? On the other side, there is the Chinese argument to say that the European Union has become increasingly a protectionist actor, more particularly in certain key areas of the economy, for instance, green technologies. The fact that the European Union has become recently, and more particularly, I would say since 2010, particularly protective of its green industry in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in some other member states. In that context, China is still very much frustrated with the number of anti-dumping, investigations which have been initiated by the European Union, anti-dumping investigations which have been obviously very much facilitated since China's accession in the WTO back in 2001, thanks to the fact that China is not recognized by the European Union as a market economy. And maybe that you may know that according to China's term of accession to the WTO back in 2001, there was the idea that China would be automatically recognized as a market economy 15 years after the European Union, after China's accession to the WTO. That being said, after these 15 years, the European Parliament still released a resolution saying that from the Parliament's perspective, China is not a market economy, and now the European Union has recently revised its anti-dumping regulations in order to make sure that it would still be able to actually apply anti-dumping investigations against China, even in this context of changing circumstances at the WTO level. So talking about the WTO, if we want to think about market power Europe and the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China, I just would like to emphasize that the World Trade Organization, and more particularly its dispute settlement mechanism, has served as an important vehicle in order to solve, the main disputes between the European Union and China. There have been so far 13 cases brought, by either the European Union or China against its strategic partner since China's accession to the WTO back in 2001. To give you an idea, in the same time frame, there are 8 disputes which have been brought by the European Union against India or the other way around, or 5 disputes which have been brought by either the EU or Brazil against its counterpart. So from that perspective, they are not the number of disputes is not way higher when you consider the number of disputes between the European Union and China and compare it with the number of disputes between the EU and some other emerging economies such as India and Brazil. Very important is the fact that the compliance records with those decisions made by the dispute settlement body of the World Trade Organization are quite good, on both sides, actually. On those 13 disputes, there has only been one compliance panel which has been established following one of the decisions in the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China. So from that perspective, we can say in a certain way that the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization is, an efficient vehicle to actually solve the key disputes which have emerged since 2001 between the European Union and China at the trade level. That's what I wanted to tell you about the economic relationship, which is at the very heart of the strategic partnership. Now, what about the EU's ability to project some of its key values? Values which are all enshrined, all encoded in one specific article of the Treaty of the European Union, that is Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union, which very clearly says that across all its foreign policies, the European Union should try to promote a set of values. You name them: democracy, the rule of law, the universality and the indivisibility of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and so on and so forth. So this is actually a legal commitment to which the European Union is supposed to abide in its external relations, including with the People's Republic of China. A legal commitment which has led part of the literature to consider the European Union as a so-called normative power. By normative power, Jan Manners actually meant the fact that the European Union is a power which is primarily based on shared norms which are at the very heart of the acquis communautaire, which means, all the laws which have been adopted at the European Union level, and that it would be, those shared norms which define the very identity of the European Union, not only internally, but also as an external, as an international actor. And the point that I would like to make here is the fact that the EU-China strategic partnership has really tested the ability of the European Union to behave and to be successful as a normative power. So let's shift now to the EU-China strategic partnership, and I just would like to emphasize here that this commitment to actually promote certain values has been re-emphasized a number of times in a number of documents specifically focusing on the relationship with China. And I just would like here to mention, just among many other things, a communication by the European Commission to the European Parliament and the Council on elements, including elements for a new strategy on China, which makes it very clear that the European Union partnership with China should include the promotion of human rights, but also cooperation on the rule of law. So there is not only a very clear commitment within the treaties, but also in a number of policy documents which have been released by the European Commissions and all the other, European institutions. Now, what is taking place in practice? If we want to think about the practice and the actual reality of values promotion by the European Union in the specific context of its bilateral relationship with China, it is very clear and important to mention the fact that there has been a significant shift in the last few years. The engagement with China, more particularly in the area of human rights, has literally shifted from a very confrontational engagement, which took place more particularly in the very aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre back in 1989, massacre after which the EU did impose a number of economic sanctions, but also an arms embargo, which is still into place in the relationship between the European Union member states and China. The reality was also at the time that the European Union and its member states did seize every single opportunity to make reference to the violations of human rights in China before the different UN forums. So that was the kind of reality in the 1990s. And then what we've seen as of, I would say, 1995, a kind of shift towards, let's say, quieter diplomacy. The idea was to have a less confrontational engagement in order to promote values and human rights, more particularly in the context of the EU-China strategic partnership. It is really in that kind of context that one should consider the establishment of a bilateral human rights dialogue, which has been taking place normally on an annual basis since 1997. I say normally on an annual basis in the sense that in the last few years, the dialogue has been cancelled several times by China. And I will come back in a few minutes, obviously, on the kind of difficulties encountered in that dialogue. But what's very clear is that this dialogue taking place at the diplomatic level, at the bilateral level, does testify of the fact that there has been a kind of shift from confrontation to, let's say, what was aimed to be a more constructive dialogue on human rights between the European Union and China. Given the number of difficulties encountered into that specific dialogue, the European Union has also tried to find new entry points, new ways to engage China with regard to those different values included in Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union. And it is really in that context that one should consider the establishment of a so-called legal affairs dialogue back in 2016. To make a long story short, the idea of the European Union was initially to replicate a German experience, which was the idea of having a rule of law dialogue which has existed actually between Germany and China since 1999. As you can see, there has been a kind of shift in the denomination of the dialogue. So initially the idea was to call it a rule of law dialogue, but then the Chinese refused to call it a rule of law dialogue. Quite interesting, right? Knowing this kind of discourse or narrative on building a socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. And now it's actually called a legal affairs dialogue, which, I quote, starts from the recognition that it is necessary to deepen the understanding of each other's legal system, and there was indeed a need to establish an EU-China legal affairs dialogue for policy exchanges, mutual learning and cooperation in legal affairs. As you can see here, the topics which have been discussed so far are way less sensitive than those topics which are discussed in the context of the human rights dialogue. I mean, we are talking about consumer protection, e-commerce, better regulation, the revision of China's civil codes, but let's nevertheless not underestimate all the human rights components which are indirectly linked with those different topics discussed in the legal affairs dialogue. When you think about e-commerce and consumer protection, you're also talking about data protection. I mean, data protection, which has increasingly, significant influence, significant impacts from a human rights perspective. So from that perspective, there are a number of links, and we should really see the establishment of this EU legal affairs dialogue as, from the European perspective at least, as a way for the European Union to find new entry points in order to engage China in the area of values. Now the question is, obviously, to what extent is the European Union successful in promoting those values, namely human rights, rule of law. Let's forget about democracy, but let's stick to human rights and the rule of law. Many would indeed argue that European Union values are, I quote, dead on arrival. When the European Union tries to promote those values, they are just dead when they arrive in China, if they get there at a certain point. Many arguments in favor of this idea of EU values being dead on arrival. The first argument here is that there is a complete lack of coherence in the way the European Union actually promotes those values in the context of the EU-China strategic partnership. And I would like here to mention more particularly the fact that, we have seen recently an increasing division between member states, between the EU member states, with regard to the necessity to emphasize human rights in the context of the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China. To give you a few examples, it is only a limited number of member states who have supported a statement before the UN Human Rights Council back in 2015, a statement which was proposed by the United States at the time to actually denounce the so-called 709 crackdown, which is a crackdown which has started back in July 2015 against human rights activists in China. We are talking just for the year 2017 about between 300 and 500 lawyers who have been prosecuted without any reasons in China in the context of that crackdown against any kind of human rights activism or any kind of human rights lawyering. So only a few number of member states have supported that statement, and even worse from the European Union perspective, it was the first time back in 2017 that the European Union was not able to come up with a joint statement to be delivered at the annual session of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. So normally until 2017, every year, there was a joint statement which was made by all EU member states speaking with one voice, saying all the things which are wrong in China from a human rights perspective. And actually it was the first time in 2017 that one member state actually was successful in blocking the idea of adopting a joint EU statement. That member state was Greece at the time back in 2017. The overall idea of Greece, as it is the case of countries such as Hungary or Poland, is actually to make sure that they can secure investments from China. And in that context, blaming China for its bad human rights records is, from their perspective, not the best idea in order to make sure that they keep getting those Chinese investments. So there is very much, in a certain way, from the perspective of individual member states, the prioritization of interests, getting investments, over the promotion of those values that the European Union is supposed to advocate in favor of. And it is really in that context that one should see, this call by a number of non-governmental organizations who have called back in 2017 for the cancellation of the annual human rights dialogue with China, saying simply that it was literally a joke. Why do we need to have such a dialogue if it's not to have anything coming out of it at the end of the day? Also, one of the reasons, obviously, which is linked to this idea of EU values, being dead on arrival, does relate, to the evolutions or to the actual state of affairs of China's domestic legal system. The fact that there have been recently, even a more significant rejection of Western values. I mean, a rejection which was made very clear, I mean, in an intra-party document which has been called Document 9, a document which was circulated in the aftermath of the 2014 annual plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, and a document which made it clear that the promotion of so-called universal values are an attempt to weaken the theoretical foundation of the party's leadership. So from that perspective, I mean, the promotion of universal values, human rights, freedom of the press, NGOs as they are understood, I mean, in the Western liberal democratic world, have become ideas which have become even more controversial than they actually were in China until a few years ago. So it's quite a negative picture, right? I mean, and from that perspective, there are many arguments in favor of the idea of saying that those EU values would actually be dead on arrival. Now, you can also find, I mean, a number of arguments in favor of the idea of the European Union keeping doing these things, right? To keep trying to promote those values. First of all, there is the idea of maybe that socialization is not the right word, but at least to oblige China to at least coordinate on those issues. When you have the annual human rights dialogue between the European Union and China, China is forced in a certain way to come up with a joint answer which is, I mean, the fruit of a balance between the different ministries, the State Council, the Foreign Ministry, and all the other departments of the Chinese government involved in human rights related issues, which is obviously already quite a step. There is also the idea that China has also become increasingly critical about existing human rights violations within the European Union. So recently, I mean, you've seen changes in which the human rights dialogue is no longer only about the European Union blaming China for its human rights violations, but on the other side, you have China blaming the European Union, for good reasons in a way, for some of the human rights violations taking place in certain member states, the rights of the Roma people, I mean, the whole human rights related, the whole, I mean, migration crisis related human rights issues, and you name them, right? Then we should also not underestimate the importance of quiet diplomacy, and more particularly, I mean, the European Union has been doing quite a lot of quiet diplomacy to actually support a number of those human rights lawyers I've been referring to, I mean, making visiting them in prison, attending their trials and stuff like that, which has in a certain way also an impact from a human rights perspective. But let's say that very clearly, and this is the argument that I want to put forward here, there is the idea of the EU-China strategic partnership really testing the ability of the European Union to be an efficient normative power able to project some of its values in the context of the EU-China strategic partnership. Now, the argument that I would like to make here is, how can we reconcile? How can we solve this paradox? The fact that on the one side we have a growing economic interdependence between the European Union and China, confirming the very economic nature of the European integration process, but also of China's reforms process. And on the other side, how can we reconcile this state of affairs with the idea that, according to the treaties at least, the European Union is supposed to promote those values included in Article 21 across all its foreign policies. And here, I just would like to emphasize the fact that the ongoing negotiations of a bilateral investment treaty between the European Union and China could be that kind of entry point, a kind of possibility in a certain way to reconcile the promotion of values with the defense of the interests, not only of the European Union, but also with the interests of the member states. And to be able to get to that point, I just would like to start by showing you, I mean, two graphs. I mean, this graph, I mean, does represent, I mean, the actual state of Chinese investments within the European Union, that's in red, and then in blue you see the value of EU FDI transactions in China. As you can see, I mean, there are way more Chinese investments in the European Union than you do have European investments in China. And as you can see, quite interestingly, is that, I mean, it's really after 2011, which marked the so-called a sovereign debt crisis in a number of member states, that we've literally seen a surge in Chinese investments in a number of member states of the European Union. And just to be a little bit more specific about that, I just wanted to show you this graph in order to identify the main destinations of those Chinese investments across the EU member states. I mean, in red here, you can see the Chinese investments in the big three countries, namely France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. So as you can see, I mean, there is still a big majority of the Chinese investments taking place in those well-established, stable economies, namely Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. But what we've also seen recently is quite an increase in the investment stocks, more particularly in Southern Europe, here in yellow, and also, I mean, in Central and Eastern Europe, which you can see here in brown, okay? So we've really seen a surge of investments, more particularly in the areas of manufacturing, agriculture, and infrastructure in countries such as Greece, Hungary, and Poland. So though, I mean, the majority of the investments is still directed towards the big member states, we can also see here that China is trying to diversify a little bit its investments across a greater number of member states. The whole point of this argument on the EU-China BIT starts from a new reality. A new reality that is the fact that it is only recently that the European Union has gained the power to negotiate bilateral investment treaties. Until the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty back in 2008, it was indeed the member states who had the power to negotiate bilateral investment treaties with external partners. So today, you still have 27 bilateral investment treaties between individual EU member states and the People's Republic of China. Don't ask me why, but Ireland doesn't have a bilateral investment treaty with China. I don't know the reason for that, but there are 27 member states who have already a bilateral investment treaty with China. But now, since the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, there is the idea that it is now the European Commission who has the power, on behalf of the member states, to negotiate bilateral investment treaties, and the European Union actually started negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China a few years ago. Now, as you can easily imagine, as a new competence, as a new power at the European Union level, the EU needs to wonder what they want to include in these bilateral investment treaties. So from that perspective, the overall normative scope of the bilateral investment treaty is still a big question. It's the first time that the European Union negotiates a standalone bilateral investment treaty with a third actor. You have a number of free trade agreements which have been recently negotiated by the European Union, which include an investment chapter, but this is the first time that there is a standalone investment agreement negotiated by the European Union. And if we want to understand, I mean, this significant question, it is very important to recognize a global trend. A global trend in which bilateral investment treaties, in particular, or international investment agreements in general, have been recalibrated. There is more and more this idea that bilateral investment agreements should not only be about investments. There is more and more the recognition, and India is obviously, when you think about the India model BIT, it's a key example that BITs are also there to make sure that the state can protect human rights, can protect a certain level of corporate social responsibility, a certain level of environmental protection, a number of areas which are obviously very much influenced by foreign direct investments. So it is really in that context that very early after the transfer of competence from the member states level to the European Union level, that a number of European Union institutions made it very clear that investment treaties negotiated by the European Union should not be about investments only. And this is a sharp contrast with the past practices of the member states. If you look at the existing BITs between, I don't know, Germany and China, Italy and China, there is no reference to environmental protection, there is no reference to CSR, there is no reference to human rights. But now there is a treaty-based obligation for the European Union to adopt a comprehensive approach towards the negotiation of those bilateral investment treaties. You remember Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union. And I just would like to make that clear, make reference more particularly to a resolution which was adopted by the European Parliament back in 2011, which made it clear that BITs negotiated by the European Union should also be based on investor obligations in terms of compliance with human rights and anti-corruption standards as part of a broader partnership between the EU and developing countries for the purpose of reducing poverty. So very much the idea that investment agreements should not be about investments only, but should also include references to a number of issues, human rights being one of them. Now, obviously, as you can easily imagine, it's not that easy, right? How can the EU make China accept to have references to human rights included in the bilateral investment treaty? When I'm talking about references to human rights, you can think of different solutions, right? You can think of a general, vague reference to human rights included in the preamble of the bilateral investment treaty. This is something that the European Union did in the free trade agreement, which has just been negotiated with Japan. The Japanese were really not happy about it, but the EU was pushy enough for Japan to accept a reference to the joint commitments towards the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the main protocols actually attached to the Universal Declaration, so that's one option. Or obviously you can also think of a general exception clause, similar to the one included in the India model BIT, which would make reference to a number of issues, human rights being one of them. Now, obviously, it's not easy, more particularly in a context where, Chinese investments in Europe, are a very controversial issue for a number of reasons. First of all, there is still very much of a question on the genuine nature of those Chinese investments. You all know about the Belt and Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road. We are still all wondering what it will be about, right? Is it investment only, or are there, other objectives which Beijing tries to achieve through the establishment of this Belt and Road Initiative, whatever it means, right? Because we still need to see things materialize in a certain way in order to understand what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about. But there is a kind of skepticism in a way in which, a number of analysts would see a kind of geo-economic strategy, behind those investments, and hence be very suspicious towards those Chinese investments. Then there is also obviously the question of the potential impact on labor rights protection within the European Union in case of massive, Chinese investments in certain member states. Here I just would like to emphasize the fact that so far so good. When you look at the Chinese investments in a number of member states, it is very clear that China has not tried to export in a certain way its labor model to the EU member states. Let me just take one specific example. The investment of the Chinese state-owned enterprise COSCO, which is China Ocean Shipping Company, which now owns, a majority of the shares of one of the main harbors around the Mediterranean Sea, namely in Greece, the Paris harbor. Studies have really shown the fact that actually Greek workers working for COSCO were way happier than their colleagues actually working for the Greek counterpart in terms of their labor rights and the different rights they have in the context of their work for COSCO. So there is a very high politicization, and hence, the question remains as to whether, the bilateral investment treaty offers a kind of new potential entry gate for the European Union to actually engage China in the context of, to engage China in the specific area of human rights. And there are very contrasting views. You have here, more particularly, a significant discrepancy between the perspective of certain member states who are really not willing to use, the bilateral investment treaty as a vehicle to promote certain human rights in the context of the bilateral relationship with China. But you also have divisions within or between the European Union institutions themselves. Within the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission, they're very much in favor of having something which only relates to investment, right? It's way easier. Please don't bother us with your human rights issues. That's not our business. While obviously when you talk about the diplomatic services, the European External Action Service more particularly, which corresponds to what you could call the European Union Foreign Ministry, they are way more, interested in having a kind of reference to human rights in the context of this bilateral investment treaty. Bilateral investment treaty, which the European Union recognizes will have a significant impact on a number of human rights. First of all, obviously, on investors' rights. The whole question of expropriation in China is still a very tricky one, when you know that China's property law of 2007 includes a very broad understanding of public interest, which actually enables the state to expropriate, investors or individuals very easily. So indeed, the agreement will have an impact on the investors' rights. But let's not underestimate the indirect impact on the rights of actors other than investors. And I just would like here to take one particular example. If you have a dispute between a European investor and a Chinese company, if you have an international arbitral award which needs to be released, what will be the flexibility or the possibility for a European NGO to actually contribute to the proceedings? In a context where China has adopted 2 years ago a very stringent and very controversial law on the activities of foreign NGOs in China. So you see, that's one practical example in which, indeed, the bilateral investment treaty could serve as a kind of vehicle for the European Union to protect some specific human rights which could come at stake, more particularly in the which could be at stake, more particularly in the context of this EU-China bilateral investment treaty. So, after this diversion, let me come to the last points that I would like to make here today. And these two last points do relate to the idea that we are now facing a historical momentum. A historical momentum actually on both sides. On the side of China, but also on the side of the European Union. On the Chinese side, obviously, we are talking about the 40th anniversary of China's reforms. We are talking about the idea which has been put forward by President Xi, that is that socialism with Chinese characteristics is now entering a new era. A new era which will have huge implications internally. The challenge internally for China is to make sure that the rapid economic growth trajectory which has characterized China's reforms can be made more sustainable. There is the idea also of decreasing the huge income gaps which exist between the different parts of the country. Coastal areas, central areas, majority ethnic groups, minority ethnic groups, and you all name them, right? But also externally, there is a new era which is coming. How to make sense of the enduring crisis of the post-World War II international liberal order? China needs to make sense of that. There are choices to be made. And these choices, more particularly in view of recent political changes within China, have led a number of analysts to talk not about a new era, but rather about the end of an era. The fact that the 40th anniversary of China's reforms would actually mark the end of the reform era. And I just would like here to make reference to a book which has been published by Fordham Law School professor Carl Minzner like a month ago. It's an OUP book which I would really recommend. It's also a very easy read. The title of the book is The End of an Era. And the book does focus on what Minzner and a number of other analysts call the authoritarian revival in China. No doubt that China has always been, since 1949, a one-party state. But we are still now witnessing new trends, new realities, or maybe you could also say the return of certain realities which had disappeared since the establishment of the reform process, which Deng Xiaoping started at the end of the 1970s. Let me just take a few examples. A few months ago, Article 79 of the PRC constitution was amended. The limit of two five-year term mandates for the Chinese presidents was repealed within the Chinese constitution. It's a huge change in comparison with what characterized China's governance system since the beginning of the reform era. We are no longer talking about a one-party state which is characterized by a collective leadership. You may be a one-party state, but still rely on a number of individuals. We are now talking about the concentration of power, which we had not seen actually for a number of years, which leads a number of analysts talking about a revival of the past in a certain way. A revival, more particularly, of what was known under Mao Zedong between 1949 and 1976. Another tendency which would testify to this authoritarian revival does relate to a number of new laws which have been adopted within China. You can think of the 2015 new national security law. You can think of this 2016 law on foreign NGOs. I mean, a number of laws which have actually created a shrinking space for contestation and challenges to the governance system as it is foreseen by Xi Jinping and its current administration. I'm not saying that everything was rosy and beautiful before that, but at least there was a little bit more space. If you look at human rights lawyers, for instance, until, I would say, the year 2010, there was some space for those human rights lawyers to act. I mean, they were not prosecuted, they were not put under house arrest, their families were not torn apart, they were not tortured, they did not disappear, they did not die. These are the realities of human rights lawyers in China today. And this is a trend which has just started a few years ago. So what I mean here is that China now is no longer trying to dilute those so-called Western values. It is just rejecting them. And that's a kind of important shift. And then obviously there is the fact that China has lost patience in a certain way. China, together with a number of other countries, Russia being one of them, make it very clear that they are tired with the Western liberal democratic so-called values diplomacy. Why are you teaching this? I mean, how do you dare? Just look at the way, you were able to resist the 2008 financial crisis. Just look at where we stand now. So there is really that kind of idea that there is, there is a clear loss of patience with regard to the promotion of those universal values by a number of actors, the European Union being one of them. And obviously the question is, what's the future of a relationship between the European Union and China in that context? Collaboration will be more needed than ever. When you think about the ongoing trade war, or whatever you want to call it, between the EU and the US, and between China and the US, cooperation is more needed than ever. That's for the economic collaboration. But then on the other side, a normative engagement will become increasingly difficult. So from that perspective, this contradiction I've been talking about is very likely to become even more prominent in the future. And China is obviously not the only one to blame for that. There are so many issues that the European Union is facing internally. It's the first time that I mention it in this lecture, Brexit. Coming from London and coming from Belgium myself, Brexit is obviously an important issue, but there is the question of what the future of the European integration process will be made of. What we hear now is the idea to institutionalize a multiple speed Europe. The fact that Europe would be made of different groups. That's the idea of French President Macron, who would like to divide Europe, I think, into 4 to 5 groups with some core member states, which would actually deepen the integration process. These member states include, the usual suspects of funding countries of the European Union, like, Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands more particularly. But the main point which I would like to make here relates to the numerous challenges which relate to the very normative identity of the European Union. The problem does not only relate to the ability of the European Union to promote those values included in Article 21 of the European Union. In today's European Union, the challenge is primarily about making sure that those values, human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, are respected within the European Union. When you think about the realities of countries such as Hungary, Poland, Romania, these member states have faced tremendous attacks against, some very basic rights, which are supposed to be foundational values of the European Union. Freedom of the press, freedom of education, freedom of assembly, freedom of circulation, you just name them. And that's a reality in a number of member states. The fact is that a number of member states did join the European Union back in 2004. A number of member states were before that under the influence of the Soviet Union. Central and Eastern European countries for most of them. And the fact is that before the accession of a country to the European Union, countries need to respect a set of criteria. These are called the Copenhagen criteria. Among those criteria, you have the idea that candidate countries should respect the basic values: human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and all the other ones. If they do not prove that they comply with those values, they cannot get in. That's the reality before accession. So the EU is powerful before the accession. But what the EU came up to realize is that the European Union is very ill-equipped after the accession to make sure that the same member states keep complying with those values: human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Which leads, a number of European leaders to make statements such as the one you can see on this slide. I'm here referring to a quote by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, which he made back in 2014. I don't think that our European Union membership precludes us from building an illiberal new state based on national foundations. Today, the world tries to understand systems which are not Western, not liberal, maybe not even democracies, yet they are successful. I'm not quoting Xi Jinping or whatever kind of authoritarian leadership here. I'm talking about the Prime Minister of a country who accessed the European Union at a certain point and did commit, whether they liked it or not, to a set of values, right? And this is the kind of challenge that the European Union is facing today. So obviously in that context, the promotion of values externally becomes even more difficult. Because how do you want to advocate in favor of certain values when you are not successful in protecting them internally, as it is now the case in a number of member states, Hungary being one of them. So just to conclude, I really would like to leave some time for discussion here. Just to sum up, the key arguments which I wanted to present today. The first one is that I think that the European Union-China strategic partnership is a good story, or has a good story to tell us about the scope and limitations of China's reforms, which have been primarily economic reforms and not really political reforms, but also a good story about the ability of the European Union to be more than a market power, and in this specific case, to be a normative power. Then the second key argument was the idea that the BIT negotiations with the People's Republic of China are, I think, a significant test case. A significant test case in which the European Union has the possibility to try to reconcile the protection of its key interests, attracting as many Chinese investments as possible, with the promotion of some of its key values. And this could be actually what was meant in the global strategy, a concept that Kellyanne did refer to in her kind introduction, to the idea of principled pragmatism. The fact that the European Union indeed should try to promote its values, but that it should not forget about its interests. That's, I think, the whole idea of principled pragmatism. How can we reconcile the defense of EU interests with the very normative nature of the European Union as it is anchored in the treaties which are at the very heart of the European Union legal order. Now, that being said, I just would like us to always keep in the back of our head the fact that all these developments, and more particularly the ability that the European Union and China will have to reinvent their bilateral relationship, in a way in which hopefully they can reconcile in a certain way those contradictions I've been talking about, will be very much conditioned to the evolution of this so-called crisis of the post-World War II international liberal order. Because what are we talking about here? We are talking about the future of liberal values, the future of universalism, and also the future of the relationship between the key stakeholders in the global arena. And you can obviously name them: emerging powers, BRICS, United States, and maybe the European Union. But I would like to leave a question mark here. I thank you very much for your attention, and please do not hesitate to ask as critical